Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Kiddushin. We are up to Perek Aleph, Mishnah Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'elu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Ranbai, Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Chana bat Miriam, Sason ben Ryan, Yoshua ben Shifra, Menuchatam began Eden, Amen. And Le'abdir ben Chaim Nechaim, V'derefua Shenemav, Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, Betoch Shach Cholei Israel. As a rule, an act called a kinyan is needed in order to transfer ownership of something from one person to another. Different acts are needed to acquire different things, as the following Mishnayot will explain. In some cases, the kinyan is the act of payment. The buyer acquires the item when he pays for it, but in other cases, a different act is required, as we will learn. This Mishnah discusses how to acquire a Jewish servant. A Jewish man can become the servant of another Jew in two ways. He can sell himself because he is poor, or the court can sell him if he stole something and cannot repay it. Such a servant is known as a Hebrew servant, Eved Ivri, and is subject to certain laws. The Mishnah describes how he can be acquired by his master and how he goes free. Eved Ivri nikne bekesef uvishtar. A Hebrew servant is acquired with money, meaning the master pays for him, or with a document. Now, in the case of a master paying for him, if the servant was sold by the court, the master gives them the money and they use it to pay back what he stole. If he sold himself, the master gives the money to him. It is not necessary to pay the full price to acquire the servant. Even giving just a pruta, the smallest coin, is a valid kinyan. Although the buyer still owes the rest of the money, he becomes the master of the servant right away. And in the case of a document, the master gives him a document that says, "You are hereby acquired by me." V'koneh atzmo b'shanim, and he acquires himself from his master, meaning he goes free either by completing 6 years of service. A Hebrew servant is sold for a term of 6 years. At the end of the 6 years, he automatically goes free, as the Torah says in Sefer Shemot, chapter 21, verse 2. Now, a servant sold by the court is never sold for more than 6 years. One who sold himself, however, can agree to a longer term of service. Ubayovel, another way that he can acquire himself back from his master, is at the beginning of the Yovel, the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year, Yovel, occurs every 50 years, right after the end of 7 Shemitah cycles. At the beginning of Yovel, every Hebrew servant goes free automatically, even if his 6-year term is not yet up, and ancestral lands sold during the previous 49 years automatically go back to the original owners, as the Torah writes in Vayikra, chapter 25, verses 8 to 13, and verse 40. Ubigion kesef, another way that the Hebrew servant can acquire himself back is by deducting money, meaning he deducts from his purchase price the value of the years he served, and he pays the balance to the master. If the servant had already worked part of his term, that time is deducted from his price. For example, if he worked 3 years of his 6-year term, he can pay the master half of his purchase price and go free. When a servant wishes to pay back the balance of his purchase price, the master must accept the money and set him free. Now, a Jewish girl can also be sold as a servant, known as a Hebrew maidservant, and Ama Ivriya, as discussed in Shemot chapter 21, verse 7. She is acquired through money or a document, just like a male servant. The Mishnah discusses how she goes free. Yitera alav Ama Ivriya, a Hebrew maidservant, has an advantage over a Hebrew servant, because in addition to going free in the same way as a Hebrew servant, shekona et atzma b'simanin, she also acquires herself back by developing signs of physical maturity. As soon as she reaches the age of 12 and grows 2 pubic hairs, she is legally considered an adult. At that point, she goes free, even if her 6-year term is not yet up. Now, a Hebrew servant may choose to remain a servant even after his 6-year term is over. Such a servant is known as a nirtzah. The Mishnah teaches how a master acquires a nirtzah for this additional term and how he goes free. Ha-nirtzah nikne birtziah. A nirtzah is acquired by his master for a new term of service by their master making a hole in the servant's ear. If the servant declares that he wants to keep serving his master, he presses his ear against a door or doorpost, and the master makes a hole in the servant's ear with an awl, a pointed tool, as the Torah describes in Shemot chapter 21, verses 5 to 6. And the Gemara in Kiddushin, page 14b, says, only a servant who was sold by the court may become a nirtzah, not a servant who sold himself. V'koneh et atzmo bayovel v'mitat ha'adon, and he acquires himself back from his master at the beginning of Yovel or upon the death of the master. He does not serve the master's heirs, as opposed to a regular Hebrew servant who does not go free if his master dies during his 6-year term. If the master has sons, he must serve them until the 6 years are over. And that is end of Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Gimel discusses now how a Canaanite slave owned by a Jew can be acquired and freed. In a standard case, a Canaanite cannot become the slave of a Jew unless he chooses to convert to Judaism. At first, he undergoes a partial conversion, which obligates him to keep most mitzvot, but not all of them. When he is freed, he becomes a full Jew who is obligated to observe all the mitzvot. The Mishnah begins, Eved Kenani nikne bekesav uvishtar uvchazaka. A Canaanite slave is acquired through money, meaning the master pays for him. A Canaanite can sell himself or his son as a slave. A slave can also be sold by his master to someone else, whatever the case. The buyer can acquire the slave by paying the seller. Another way a Canaanite slave is acquired is through a document. The seller gives the buyer a document in which it is written that he is transferring the slave to the new master. And yet another way to acquire a Canaanite slave is through an act of ownership, meaning the slave does an act that is usually done by a slave for his master. For example, he puts on or takes off the master's shoes, bathes him or rubs oil into his skin, showing that the master owns him. Now the Mishnah discusses 2 ways that a slave can go free. The first way, v'koneh atzmo bekesef al yedei achirim. We're going to see that these 2 ways are according to Rabbi Meir. He acquires himself back, meaning he becomes free through money given by others. Someone else pays the master for him. Someone pays the master the slave's value for the purpose of freeing him. The slave becomes free even if he does not know about it or agree to it. Now this can be done only by someone else. According to Rabbi Meir, we're going to see the slave cannot pay for himself because everything he has belongs to his master, so he does not have money with which to buy his freedom. The second way, he can go free by acquiring a freedom document himself from the master, a document with a statement such as "You are hereby free," as the Gemara describes in Kiddushin, page 6b. Now, the document sets him free only if it is accepted by the slave himself. No one can accept it for him without his agreement. Div Rabbi Meir, these are the words of Rabbi Meir. As a rule, a person can acquire something on behalf of his friend without the friend's knowledge or consent, but only if it is a complete benefit for the friend, what we call zakina adam shelo befanav. For example, if Reuven buys an object with the intention of acquiring it for Shimon, Shimon acquires the object even if he knows nothing about it. However, if acquiring the object is not a complete benefit for Shimon, no one can acquire it for him unless he agrees. Our Tana holds that it is not a complete benefit for a slave to go free, because when he is freed, he becomes a full-fledged Jew and forbidden to cohabit with the Jewish slave who was permitted to him while he was a slave. It is assumed that a slave considers this a disadvantage, therefore no one else can acquire a freedom document for him without his agreement. However, a slave can't be freed with money even without his consent. This is because his consent is needed only when he has to acquire something, in this case the freedom document. No one can acquire it for him without his agreement. However, when a slave is freed with money, he does not acquire anything. The master simply accepts the money and the slave goes free automatically, and this can be done even without the slave's consent. The sages agree that a slave goes free through payment or a freedom document, but they hold that anyone may give or accept these things. But the sages say, Bekesef al yedei atzmo, a slave can go free even through money that he gives himself to his master, because according to the sages, it is possible for a slave to own money, as will be explained later in the Mishnah. And he can also go free through a freedom document that other people accept on his behalf from his master, even if he does not know about it. According to the sages, a document sets him free, not only if it is accepted by the slave himself, but even if it is accepted by someone else for him, because according to the sages, it is a clear benefit for a slave to become free. The advantage of becoming free from slavery outweighs any disadvantages that may be involved. Therefore, someone else can accept the freedom document for a slave, because a person can acquire something for his friend without his consent if it is a clear benefit for the friend. And the sages now explain how the slave can get money of his own. A slave can pay for his freedom provided the money comes from other people, meaning someone gives money to the slave and stipulates that it should not become the master's property. Such money does indeed belong to the slave, and if he wants, he can use it to buy his freedom. However, the commentaries explain the slave cannot use money that he earned or found, because that money automatically becomes his master's property. And that is the Nabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.